So is Matt up there on the flight deck writing this equation out and solving it? No, of course he's not. Would, if we gave him an Algebra 2 problem with a joint variation and said, write this problem, would he be able to do it? I don't really know. But it's important to Matt to know, when he's up there in the plane, what's happening to the lift when the altitude is changing. When you're at a high altitude, the density of the air is really low, so it's harder to create lift up there. When density decreases, your lift is going to decrease. That's important for Matt to understand. It's also important for him to understand that out of all of those variables, the only one that's being squared is the speed. So the only one that has the biggest control over his lift, that he has control over, is the speed of the airplane. It's important for him to know that when he changes the speed, especially at a high altitude, it's going to have a big effect on his lift. So what's important to Matt when he's up there flying the plane is not the computations, it's not the solving, it's not the writing equations. What's important is the relationships between all these variables. It's the bigger picture. He needs to be able to know what's going to happen if one of these variables changes. What's going to happen if all of a sudden we start losing altitude and we gain air density now? Or what's going to happen if I lose an engine and so my velocity decreases really fast? He needs to know how that's going to happen, how that's going to change the flight of the plane's path. He has computers and manuals to actually find the numbers for him, but he needs to know how these variables all relate to each other. And that's the way that math really happens in the real world. That's to say nothing of the engineers who designed the plane, actually in the first place, who built the plane, who designed the computer systems in the plane, who wrote the software that does all the calculations in the computer. All of those people need to really understand this equation. They need to really know how to solve it and to program it. So do the people who write the manual telling pilots how to fly this plane, the instructors who first teach pilots how to fly. Air traffic controllers need to understand this because they need to understand what they can and can't expect an airplane to do. You can't all of a sudden magically make a plane gain or lose altitude. You have to know how long it's going to take them to do that based on these relationships. So just this one small concept, and there's already so many people who probably don't know that they're doing Algebra 2, and yet they have to be able to understand it. They have to be able to make these connections and understand these relationships. So that's how math is really seen in the real world. You don't always realize that you're doing it. You don't always realize that you're solving an equation, but you're using what you've learned in the past. So why don't we just say that when you ask, how are we going to use this? And there's a few reasons. Number one, that was one small example, and it's taken me a while to say that. So in a 40-minute class period, I can't take out 15 minutes to go off on a story. We don't want to lose you. I would say that I most often hear this question after we've just done something really hard for the first time. And so you're frustrated. What you're really asking is, why do I need to keep working at this? Why is it worth it to me to keep going? Because right now, I feel like giving up. And so it is important to learn perseverance, and I'm sure you're going to hear about that. But besides that, you need to know how the calculations work in order to get to that sort of upper level understanding about how it's all working together. It's also harder to do. It's harder to teach upper level thinking like that than it is to just say, let's plug in what would the lift be if the density was this, and the area was this, and the speed was this. That's a pretty easy calculation to do. That's a pretty easy calculation for us to teach you how to do. It's harder to talk about, well, what would change if everything else stays the same except what this changes? How would that affect your lift? That's harder to teach. And it's harder to teach, number one, just because it takes a while to build the vocabulary to get there, but also because all of the materials that we have are sort of based on those original, the way we learned. Just do the calculations over and over and over again. And the school system, and I'm sure if you've been to other lectures, you've heard about this, the school system just has so much inertia that it takes a while for the materials that we have, the textbooks that we have, to realize that you don't necessarily need to just do the calculations anymore. We have computers, we have calculators that do that. You not only need to understand how the calculations work, but be able to explain what happens to them, be able to explain why they're important, be able to write about what happens when you change one of these things. And probably the biggest reason why we can't easily answer this question for you is we just don't know. I'm lucky enough that this conversation literally happened a few days before Ms. Diaz asked me to come do this. And so I happened to know how this one equation related to this one field. But I don't know how investment bankers use math. I'm pretty sure that they do. I remember going to college with people who were studying to be investment bankers, and they sure took a lot of math. So I'm pretty sure that they probably use it in their day-to-day lives, but I don't know exactly what equations they're using. I don't know exactly what biologists are using when they do their studies. I don't know exactly what engineers are doing. And I don't know if I could break down the math that they've spent 10 years learning to a place where you can understand it as a sophomore or junior. So it's tough and we just don't know. And that's one of the places where we as teachers have to do a better job making sure that we're staying connected to the outside world. Because the longer we stay in this building without sort of looking out, the farther removed we get from how these things are actually going on in the real world. So it's important to be able to hear from people who have been teachers and who have worked in the real world. It's important for us to be able to talk to other people so that we can then take those back to you. Because the bottom line is that when are you really going to use this? Are you really going to use this? Yes, you definitely will.